So there's a few things in this world that confuse me. Why people put sidecars on motorcycles and think they're going to be able to travel around corners. Why we have endless country music and blues music is disappearing. And also how things that are really substantial can just disappear in a short time. I'm Ben, this is my RDO. Somewhere under my feet here are the remains of a vertical mining shaft that goes over a kilometer into the earth. This is what's left of the great extended Hustlers Reef mine, and this is its story. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so little bit of whiteboard time just to explain the background. What is a reef? What's going on here? This is Bendigo. This is the CBD. Echuca's up to the north. Melbourne's down that way. Whatever. The first gold they found was alluvial gold. It was in the soil, in the sands, in the creek, and the waterways. And they could filter out the soil and they could get it out that way. What they discovered is, for reasons only known to rockologists, that there was gold in quartz lines. And early on, they'd find these quartz lines close to the surface and they dig them up and expose them and break them in what's called an open cut mine. Break up the quartz by hand, usually by hammers and stuff, with some blasting as well, with gunpowder in the early days. And they could extract the gold from those. It was a lot of work, but they could get quite a bit of gold. The realization came that these quartz reefs continued underground, and that's where most of Bendigo's gold came from. This was a unique situation, not unique in the world, but a fairly unique situation. There were these massive quartz reefs underground that had lots and lots of gold in them. So the reefs tend to run in this sort of direction. This is the Hustlers Reef here, slipping right under the corner of the Bendigo CBD. We've got the Deborah Reef here. We've got Garden Gully, which was actually Bendigo's biggest and richest reef. Sheep's Head. Chum Reef through here sort of thing. And they followed a similar sort of pattern, which again, you'd have to be a geologist to understand, but they run in sort of a diagonal cross-section to the CBD of Bendigo. So where's Hustlers Reef? Where does it run today on our world, in our map? I'll show you. So we're going to ride along. We're going to see the main mine sites for the Hustlers Reef and where they sat in today's world on the surface. I have sped up some of this footage, so if it looks like I'm riding quick, that's all it is. I just didn't want you to get too bored. All right, enjoy. So, how did Hustlers Reef get its name? Well, It's named after a man called Thomas Hustler, and he's an interesting character. He was a genuine convict. He was born in 1813 in England, and we don't know much about his early history, but at the age of 23, he was convicted for nothing less than highway robbery. He was a highwayman, and he was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land. So pretty heavy sentence. There's a bit of a perception out there that people are only transported for trivial crimes, but it wasn't really the case. Also, they only really transported people who they thought they could rehabilitate. Everyone else was basically hung in the period, so they saw something in him. His prison reports weren't the best. He was sentenced to 7 years labour as part of it. Thomas gets his certificate of freedom in about 1843. He lives in Hobart for a little while. We don't really know what happens in between, but he turns up on the Bendigo Goldfield in about 1852. He does a bit of work around the place and eventually establishes an open-cut mine on the side of the hill, which would later become known as Hustler's Hill. Hustler went into partnership with two men, Latham and Watson, and they started a mining company along the Hustler's Reef. They were one of the first to start the deep quartz seam mining where all the gold was coming from now. They also had a hand in developing early stamping presses, so machines that sort of had a great big hammer that we lifted up on a rotating cam and dropped down and used to crush the quartz. While the technology had been used in mining in other places, it had never really been used in quartz mining, so this was kind of a new application for the Goldfield in Australia. The success of the mine was partly attributed to the efficiency that they could process the quartz compared to everyone else. It became a very, very profitable mine. Eventually, Latham and Watson brought out Hustler's share for £500, quite a decent amount of money, and continued working on their own. Hustler didn't have much success after that. He eventually dies in 1863. He seemed to have run out of money. He's buried in a pauper's grave and didn't seem to have anything to his name when he passed away, which is a shame for a man who was responsible for opening up one of the richest goldfields in the world. So there was an account in the newspaper a little bit after his death from a guy, Major Stibley, who had known him back in the early days at Bendigo. And his description is such: he was about as rough and as hard swearing, hard drinking, hard working, hard living, hard-handed, hard-muscled sample of courage and recklessness as there was to be found on the diggings. I'm going to jump over a little bit. He could use his one arm as well as the best of men could use their two, and a great deal better than many of them. By usage and necessity, the power of two arms seems to have been forced into his remaining arm. It was muscled in ridges stronger than an ordinary man's leg. Pick, hammer, shovel, axe, he could use them with any man on the reef, wielding them to some purpose, a wonderful strong arm of his. It was like a branch of a tree. You should have seen him one day break up a big quartz boulder. It was as big across as a footbridge. The men had blasted it out and levered it out into an open cutting where they were working on it on the side of a hill. They were chipping away at it, and by degrees they were working into the shape of a giant billiard ball. Hustler came up and he treated them to some of his customary verbal explosives, strong enough to almost have blasted the rock asunder. Taking a hammer from one of the men, he set to work with it, and it was a sight to see him, that one-armed master of the art of stone cracking. He welted and welted with his arm, fair on the block of quartz. Blow upon blow descended on the same spot. Though not a flake flew, there was nothing to show that his blows had not been thrown away. After about 10 minutes of this, however, there was a slight movement of the rock. Hustler followed it up. The rock began to open, and by the end of 10 minutes, the big boulder that had baffled 3 men and 6 pairs of arms, 6 arms, for days fell and crumbled into pieces before the strength and expert skills of one man with one hand. If you'd been there, you would have enjoyed it. Hustler could crack stones. So let's look at our site today. This is a map from the State Library of Victoria of Bendigo in 1910. Keeping in mind the mine was in operation here. Our site's about here in the top corner. If you zoom in, it's a little bit grainy, but you can see there's a great big lake or dam here. No longer any trace of that. And I believe this is where our shafts were located in those maps. And you can see some workings in the picture. If you look at the modern map, these two roads are here in that map and still here today. That's about the location of the dam, and these are where the shafts are, I think. So these next few photos are really cool. They're from the State Library of Victoria. They're taken by a guy, Ben Pierce, in about 1860, which makes them a really early photos for the gold rush, and for anywhere really. You can see here how chaotic it is, and the mix of technologies is also interesting. So there's a horse-drawn crush in the background, and pre-stamping, this is how they would break up the quartz rock to get the gold out of it. Most of that horse will draw around a big heavy stone that would crush the rock. Interesting little bilge pump, I think it is, on the right there. Looks like it's designed to hand pump and draw water out. This photo shows a really interesting mix of technology. So you can see in the shed to the left, there's a couple of boilers there and sort of a half-built open shed, which probably helped a lot with the heat. On the right of the water is what looks like a sort of beam turn crushing machine. So I imagine there was a track in underneath those great big stones, and you pull that around much like the horse-drawn ones to crush up the quartz. It's completely silted up and looks like it's no longer in use, and I'm speculating, but maybe it's just been replaced with better technology like the stamping heads that they were introducing at the time. In the background, you can see the sort of winches, I think they're called. They're the drums with the cables on them. They would be horse-drawn, so a horse would walk around with a harness on a beam below that cable, that drum, and turn it, and that would bring the cables that raise and lower the lifts into the mine. Pretty cool. One of the things that stands out in these photos, and none of the places are named except that it's the Sandhurst or Bendigo Goldfields as we know it. There is not a tree or a plant anywhere inside. It's all been cut down and used in mines or burnt in steam machines. This next one's interesting because I actually think this is our site. So I think this is Hustler's Reef. If you look there, there's our lake. Right up the front here is, I think, the Latham and Watson mine. And up here on the left is the sites, roughly, of where our secondary and primary shaft are for the Great Extended Hustlers Reef Company. If you zoom in, you can see there's multiple horse-drawn winches on the side of the hill there, and there's a couple of winch shafts that sort of appear in the later documentation. I really wanted to zoom around this picture and hopefully find a picture of a one-armed miner, because Tom Hustler would have still been alive in 1860, but unfortunately I couldn't see anything. So having bought out Hustler, the Latham and Watson mine does better and better. And part of that's credited to them reinvesting a lot of their profits back into technology like the crushing machines and things like that. Towards the end of the 1860s, a lot of the mines were struggling because they reached the limit of what they could do with the technology they had, particularly the winches, the horse-drawn mechanisms for raising and lowering lifts could only go so deep and they can only move so fast. Latham and Watson have got the money and they've reinvested what they had into buying up a whole packet of claims along Hustler's Reef and starting what became known as the Great Extended Hustlers Reef Mining Company. Now, it's a fancy title, and you'll see almost all the mines along the reef have the term hustlers in it somewhere. You've got to remember a lot of the finance for these came from public subscription, so they were publicly floated companies. So having the name of the Hustlers Reef, which was already world famous, in the title of your mine and knowing you came from Sandhurst was really good publicity. The new mine would become an enormous operation. It had a gigantic crushing room with multiple crushers, all steam-powered winches. It would run 2 shafts down, and all the latest technology. This was the Industrial Revolution in full swing, and they were pushing the limits of what was possible. This was one of the deepest mines in the world at the time, and it was one of the most successful. So here's one of the early pictures from 1873 that covers the whole site. You can see the lake again in the front. On the left side, you can see a poppet head that's mostly covered in timbers. That's the main shaft. Later on, it went to a steel head, but that timber-covered one was there for a long time. Don't know why it was covered in timbers, but it was. You can see the long sheds that would be the crushing plants towards the middle of the frame. Then further to the right, we have the secondary shaft. That's got a steel poppet head that's exposed. You can see a horse winch next to it, and in the underground shaft you can see that's actually connected to the mine works as well. And right up the top of the hill is what's known as Pups, or the tribute mine. It's not the greatest extended hustlers mine in the world, it's just a tribute. So here's an actual photo from the 1870s as well. The mine in the foreground, I think, is the Hustler's mine, distinct from the other ones. Like I said, they've all got Hustler in the title, basically. The mining site we're looking at, the Great Extended Mine, is over towards the back. If you zoom in, you can see the wooden headset, the wood fronted headset, the long, thin shed of the crushing plant, and a couple of other poppet heads up the hill. I think in the foreground here, we're looking at the Latham and Watson mine, which is obviously still there in some form. So here's a map from 1913 of the underground works of the Great Extended Hustlers Reef mine. You can actually see the Latham and Watson shaft marked on this one, the primary and the secondary shafts. I think if you're looking at it, it's quite confusing, but I think they've actually drawn the levels slightly offset just so you can distinguish them from one another. Very confusing map, to be honest. There were about 27 floors to the mine by 1913. So here's a transverse section of the mine, also 1913 from a survey that was conducted then. And you can see the interlinkings between what's labelled as an old shaft, and it's presumably the Latham and Watson mine, and you can see the connection to the secondary shaft as well. So you might have heard people say that you could walk through mine shafts under Bendigo from one end to the other. If you've been around the town for a while, people will tell you that. It's sort of true, it's sort of not true. As you've already seen, the mines follow reef, so they follow certain lines. You couldn't just disappear one place and turn up at any random place you chose. You would have to walk along the reef lines. But there's also a little bit of truth in it. So if you look at this map here, this is the 1930 survey, and this is Hustler's Reef line. And some of the other ones probably had more extensive mines in them, but whatever. If you could jump into the United Hustlers Redden mine here, you could descend down this one to way down here to the 855-foot level, I think it is, if I'm reading that right. You could get across the tunnel here. These sort of grey areas here, I think, are stoped out, are big open areas. You could ascend up what was probably a very dodgy ladder here and come across, and you would be in the KK mine. Now, if you descended way down to the 1,436-foot level, you could come across, and this black line, I think, has all been stoped out, so you could go through that open stope, or you continue this level here, and you're now in the Comet mine. From the Comet mine, it's a short downhill through here, or through one of these winzes, to the 1,492-foot level, and then up a kind of sketchy path up through here where there's lots of little stopes. You find you're in the Hustlers Reef number 1 mine. If you ascend a level to 1,328 feet, you can get across, again, great big stoped out area through this shaft here, and you'll find you're in the Hustlers Reef mine. Now here you hit a bit of a snag, because although they get close, this level here is pretty close to what looks like an open area here, and that's sort of close. There doesn't look to be a way across into the next workings, which is actually the Great Extended Hustlers Reef workings. Now, bear in mind, the mines were operating past this survey. At least Great Extended went to 1921, and there was a revival in the 30s for some of these mines. So maybe they're more connected today, or by the time they closed down, probably not today. But, you know, from this old shaft here, which is probably the Latham and Watson mine, again, you could get down here is the Great Extended. You could get into the secondary shaft. There's an old shaft here, and you get here, but then that's about it. There's no way of crossing here. If we look further along, so this is the Hustlers Royal Reserve Park shaft. This is at the back of Camp Hill Primary School. Obviously, the school kids don't fall down there. It's capped. But you could descend down this one. There's a great big stoped out area here. Or the shaft is connected with the main shaft, the Hustlers Royal Reserve main shaft, way down at the 1,667-foot level. From there, you can climb up here to this one, and there's an open stoped area here, or up here that's very, very close to Fortuna Hustlers, but they don't look like they quite meet up, to be honest, so you probably can't do that transition either. Just one of those things. If you can get from there to there, you'd be literally crossing the city underground. And maybe these mines extended that little bit further, and it was actually possible at some stage. Now, if you're thinking of grabbing your pick and your torch and trying to find your way into these shafts, don't do it. They're incredibly dangerous. And also, they're actually probably flooded. So the water level was very, very high. It was actually a real issue for these mine companies. Bailing water out was a constant problem for them. And when the number of mines started to close and the number that was left was less and less, the effort of all that pumping water fell on smaller and smaller number of companies. Anyway, you can sort of walk under Bendigo underground. So the mining process, essentially, this is really hard rock. They had to use explosives to break it open. So a team would come in and they would bore holes for the explosives, and that's what these guys are doing. Later on, they'd use compressed air equipment to do it, which would speed up the process considerably. Those holes they bore in would be packed full of explosives. In the early days, it was gunpowder. Later on, it was TNT or dynamite, and gelignite later on again. Those explosives would be detonated. Then the rubble would be cleared away. The waste rock would be either taken to another part of the mine and dumped, or taken to the surface and dumped. Brought back to the main shaft, taken up to the surface and processed to get the gold out. Typically, it sounds like they would try and do the explosion right at the end of the shift. So they would set the charges, set the fuses and leave. And the next shift would come down and start the cleanup process, basically, because you probably didn't want people on the floor when it was blowing up, I guess. These mines ran 24 hours a day, so it was just shifts in and out, in and out, in and out. I don't think it was common to have all the floors running at once, but multiple teams certainly sound like it was a thing, working in multiple areas. They were restricted by what they could move up and down the lift, because all the ore, all the people, everything had to come up and down, the timbers, whatever it was, and that would limit the amount of work that could be done in a day. The mine would run for over half a century before eventually closing in 1921. Official gold production of the Great Extended Hustlers Reef mine is 8,646 kilos, or 8.6 tonne. Latham and Watson mine is credited with 4,665 tonnes, and the entire Hustlers Reef is credited with 28,500 tonne of gold. Now, to put this in context, the total production for gold for the entire Ballarat Goldfields was only 50.9 tonne. So this is a huge gold reef, and it made Hustlers Reef world famous at the time. Keep in mind, though, that other reefs in Bendigo, particularly the Garden Gully Reef, would produce more gold again by a magnitude, and there are actually richer mines in other parts of Victoria, particularly in Walhalla, but certainly world famous, an incredible amount of gold produced here. So the mine does have one dark chapter to its history, because it would become the location of what would be Bendigo's worst mining accident. I was sent for to go to the mine shortly after 11 o'clock on Saturday night. When I arrived, I was told the cage had been hung up in the shaft. After repairing a portion of the damage, I got down to the 1,055-foot level. The fumes here were very strong, and I could hardly smell it. The atmosphere smelled very strongly, as if gelignite had been smouldering. As I walked along the level, I came across a body, the clothes of which had been nearly blown off. I stepped over that body and saw another body. Though I looked into the faces, I could not recognize either of the men. I came out of this level as quickly as I could, and I went to the shaft. Looking in the westerly direction, I saw 2 more dead bodies. Then I sung out to my mate, whom I'd left at a higher level, that there had been a terrible calamity down here. I signalled to the engine driver and was taken to the surface. I reported the matter to Mr. Manley, the mine manager. I asked him what I was to do next. Manley told me I'd better go down to the other men were on the lower levels. Reed descended the shaft again, and having to repair more damage to the winching shaft, eventually reached a team that had been working on the level below. They'd really been struggling with all the dust that had been kicked up in the explosion. He effected a rescue of the men at great personal risk and was later commended for his action. The entire team on the floor of the explosion were killed, 7 miners. There was an inquiry and an investigation, but it ended up with essentially an open finding. They never really established the cause of the explosion. It seemed unusual that all the men were in the same area when the explosion occurred, which is evident from where they were found. Experts came and sort of testified and gave evidence that suggested the explosion was consistent with about the total supply that they would have had on the floor at the time. Dynamite at the time was a safer explosive than what had been used historically, but it was still something that could be set off by a heavy impact or by severe things. Did part of the roof come down on the box? Someone dropped something and it was just enough force. We're never going to know. We're never going to understand. So I looked up Bendigo's worst mining accident, and that's what led me to this story and to the Hustlers Reef and the rest of the story. When I first found out, 7 fatalities, my first thought was actually I'm surprised it's that few. It was a notoriously dangerous sector to work in and dangerous industry. But the reality seems to be that people died in smaller numbers. Miners didn't tend to work in large numbers. There's limited space, limited opportunity to move people up and down. So they seem to work in small teams, and they were killed in ones and twos, or they got ill, they got miner's lung, and they died at home later on. They were pushing the absolute limits of technology in a world where OH&S didn't stand for health and safety. Not sure what it stood for. Like I said, I don't think it was a particularly dangerous mine. I don't think it was any worse than the other ones. If you look at the history of any of the large mines around here, there were accidents, there were fatalities. And there were others at this site. There's a couple of men killed earlier in an explosion. A rock cave. There was a tragic incident where a 5-year-old fell down an open shaft up here as well. So it was a dangerous industry. It really, really was. So there's not much left to see from the Great Extended Hustlers Reef mine. A few lumps of footing, concrete, and some other bits put together, a few lumps on the ground. But I did actually find another trace when I did some searching. So there's some notes online, and I don't think I can put them here because I think they're copywritten. There's a historian who talks about the mines in Bendigo, and he goes through a lot of the different fields and the Hustlers Reef fields. And when he talks about the Great Extended Hustlers claim, he talks about the steel poppet legs are now at the Wattle Gully mine in Chewton. So when you put Wattle Gully mine Chewton into Google Maps, it comes up with this location. Now, I actually came down this road here, Fry's Road, on my very first video, the Harcourt Loop, so feel free to go back and have a look at that. If you drop the Google Earth dude here, you'll see someone has submitted a drone shot. Marcel, thank you very much. And look, here's a particular sample of a very spectacular, quite significantly sized old poppet head. And I would suggest it's quite likely, although I can't prove it obviously, that this was the one from the Great Extended Hustlers Reef mine. It certainly looks grand and big enough, quite a substantial piece of old engineering there. So maybe there are some traces out there for these things above ground somewhere. There's got to be some stuff underground, but maybe there are some traces above ground. You've just got to know where to look. All right, I hope you've enjoyed that video. We'll see you next time.